My family mocked me as a useless spinster and ordered me into the kitchen, so I shut down their wedding and made them watch everything they built collapse. The invitation arrived 3 weeks late. Cream cardstock that should have felt like an honor, but landed like a slap. My cousin's wedding at the estate I'd secretly saved from foreclosure, funded by money they'd conveniently forgotten I possessed. They saw me as the family's harmless spinster, living quietly off some modest trust fund, good for filling empty chairs at family gatherings. What they didn't know was that I owned 72% of everything they bragged about building. I'd spent years being invisible, thinking humility was virtue, watching them take credit for my generosity while treating me like hired help. But when Belle handed me that serving tray and suggested I help out in the kitchen, something shifted. They wanted me to fade into the background. Perfect. Because the best view of an empire's collapse is always from the shadows, and I was about to pull every single thread that held their perfect world together. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, elegant script spelling out my cousin Evander's wedding details. I should have felt honored, but something nagged at me as I turned the envelope over in my hands. The postmark showed it was mailed 3 weeks after the others went out. I knew this because my assistant, Frances, had mentioned seeing social media posts from relatives already discussing their outfits and travel plans. I set the invitation on my mahogany desk and stared out the window of my downtown office, 27 floors below, the city humming with its usual energy. But up here in my quiet sanctuary, I could think clearly. The wedding was at Willowbrook Estate, the same property I'd helped purchase and restore 5 years ago when the family wine business was struggling. Back then, Evander had begged me to invest, promising it would secure our family's legacy for generations. That was before Belle entered the picture. My phone buzzed with a text from Frances, "Confirmed your suite at Willowbrook for the weekend. Shall I pack the usual?" I typed back quickly, "Yes, and Frances, keep your phone on this weekend. I have a feeling I might need you." The drive to Willowbrook took me through rolling hills dotted with vineyards, the landscape growing more familiar with each mile. When I finally turned through the wrought iron gates, my breath caught despite myself. The estate looked magnificent, better than I'd ever imagined when I first toured the crumbling property with the real estate agent. The main house stood proud against the afternoon sky, its honey-colored stone gleaming, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that cascaded down toward the vineyard rows. But something felt different as I parked my modest sedan between a Mercedes and a BMW. The staff who used to greet me warmly now barely nodded, and the young man who took my keys didn't make eye contact. It was as if I'd become invisible, or worse, irrelevant. Inside, the welcome brunch was already in full swing. The great room buzzed with conversation and laughter, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows onto tables laden with fresh pastries and seasonal flowers. I recognized most of the faces, aunts, uncles, cousins I'd grown up with, but the warmth I expected felt muted. "Charlotte." Aunt Vivian approached with a practiced smile. "How lovely that you could make it. We weren't sure you'd be able to get away from, well, whatever it is you do these days." The comment stung more than it should have. Whatever I did, I'd built Atlas Holdings from the ground up, turning my inheritance into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that quietly supported half the family's ventures. But I'd learned long ago that bragging about money was the fastest way to lose friends and alienate family. "I wouldn't miss Evander's wedding," I replied simply. As Vivian moved on to greet other guests, I caught fragments of conversation from a cluster of aunts near the coffee station. "She doesn't really do anything productive," one whispered. "Living off her trust fund, I suppose." Another added, "At least she's not flashy about it. Remember how her mother was?" My mother, they always brought her up when they wanted to diminish me. She'd been bold and outspoken about our family's wealth, but she'd also been the one who insisted I learn to manage it responsibly. If she could see how they talked about both of us now, she'd be livid. I moved toward the buffet, hoping to avoid more awkward conversations, when a melodic voice called out behind me. "Charlotte, there you are." I turned to see Belle approaching, radiant in a flowing white sundress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her smile was picture perfect, but her eyes held a calculating coldness I'd noticed since the day Evander first introduced her. I absolutely love what you've done with your hair, she said, reaching out to touch my simple ponytail. And this dress, is it vintage? It has that wonderful thrifted charm. So down to earth and authentic. The backhanded compliment was delivered with such sweetness that anyone overhearing would think she was being kind. But I heard the message clearly: you look cheap and outdated. Thank you, Belle. You look beautiful. The estate is perfect for your special day. Oh, isn't it gorgeous? Evander and I have put so much work into making it exactly what we envisioned. All those renovations and improvements, it's finally becoming the showcase we dreamed of. She said, as if she'd been there from the beginning, as if she'd written the checks and made the difficult decisions during the financial crisis that nearly destroyed our family business, as if she'd spent sleepless nights reviewing contracts and negotiating with creditors. The rehearsal began an hour later, and I found myself looking for my assigned seat among the family section. My name wasn't on any of the elegant place cards. I stood there for a moment, checking and double-checking, until a wedding coordinator appeared at my elbow. "Oh, you must be Charlotte. I'm so sorry. We ran out of chairs in the family section. Can we set you up with a folding chair in the back? It's just for today's run-through. Just for today." The words echoed in my mind as I took my place behind rows of relatives, some of whom I'd helped through various financial difficulties over the years. From my folding chair, I watched Evander practice walking down the aisle, his tall frame confident in his perfectly tailored suit. He was handsome and charming, the golden boy of our generation. But when our eyes met briefly, he looked away quickly. That wasn't the Evander I remembered, the one who used to spend summers at my family's lake house, who'd come to me crying when his mother died, who'd held my hand at her funeral and whispered that I was the only sister he'd ever known. This new version of my cousin had learned to look through me as if I were made of glass. After the rehearsal, I passed by the bridesmaid's suite on my way to my room. The door was slightly ajar, and laughter spilled into the hallway. "Honestly, does anyone even know what Charlotte does for work?" one voice asked. "Something with investments, I think, but it's probably just managing her trust fund. She's basically the family's token rich girl, right? Like, she doesn't really contribute anything. Belle says she's sweet, but kind of irrelevant. Like, she just shows up to things because no one has the heart to uninvite her." I pressed myself against the hallway wall, feeling my cheeks burn with humiliation. These were women I'd known for years, some since childhood. I'd paid for one of their weddings when her father lost his job. I'd quietly covered another's medical bills when her insurance fell through. But to them, I was irrelevant. That evening, as I sat alone in my beautifully appointed guest suite, I found myself pulling out an old leather journal I'd kept during the family's darkest financial period. My handwriting from 5 years ago looked urgent and stressed. "Bank called again today. Evander's in tears. They're going to foreclose on the vineyard property. The whole family business could collapse. If I don't act now, we'll lose everything grandfather built." I flipped through pages documenting late-night phone calls with lawyers, meetings with accountants, and the careful restructuring of assets that had saved not just the vineyard but the entire family's financial stability. I'd mortgaged my own properties, liquidated investments, and worked 18-hour days for months to make it all come together. And now they thought I did nothing. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. Frances's name appeared on the screen. "How's the wedding weekend going?" she asked without preamble. "About as well as I expected," I replied. "Frances, I need you to do something for me. Pull together a complete financial summary of my involvement with the family business, every loan, every investment, every property transfer. Put it all in one of those red binders you're so fond of." "You're going for the nuclear option," Frances said. She'd worked with me long enough to understand the implications. "Just as a precaution," I said. "I have a feeling this weekend is going to get worse before it gets better." The next morning brought the welcome dinner held on the estate's covered terrace overlooking the vineyard. String lights twinkled overhead, and the scent of jasmine drifted from the gardens. It should have been magical, but I felt like an outsider looking in on someone else's fairy tale. I was standing near the kitchen entrance, staying out of the way of the bustling servers, when Belle appeared beside me with a tray of wine glasses in her hands. "Charlotte, perfect timing," she said with that brilliant smile. "Since you're right here by the kitchen, maybe you could help out back there. You know, make sure everyone has what they need." She thrust the tray toward me before I could respond, her voice loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. The message was clear to everyone watching: Charlotte belongs with the help, not with the family. I looked down at the tray of glasses, their crystal surfaces reflecting the fairy lights above. Around us, conversations continued, but I felt the subtle shift in attention, the way people's eyes lingered on me holding that tray like it was exactly where I belonged. For a moment, I almost took it. The old me would have smiled graciously and carried those glasses around all night, grateful just to be included somehow. But something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was reading my old journal entries, or maybe it was finally accepting that politeness and humility had only made me invisible to the people who should have valued me most. Instead, I set the tray down on a nearby table and looked Belle directly in the eyes. "I think the professional staff has everything well in hand," I said quietly. "I'll leave them to do their jobs." Her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place, but I caught the flash of anger in her eyes. "Of course," she said, her voice a degree cooler. "I just thought you might want to feel useful." The comment about feeling useful echoed in my mind long after I'd escaped to my room that night. I sat by the window overlooking the vineyard, moonlight casting silver shadows across the rows of vines I'd helped plant. Sleep eluded me as memories surfaced unbidden, images of signing loan documents at 3 o'clock in the morning, of negotiating with suppliers who threatened to cut off the family's credit, of the day I'd quietly transferred the deed to my grandmother's lake house to cover a particularly steep debt payment. I pulled out my journal again, this time reading entries from the worst period of the crisis. "Evander called sobbing today. The bank wants to seize everything by Friday. I told him not to worry, that I'd figure something out. He said I was his guardian angel. I wondered what he'd call me now." Another entry, dated 2 months later, signed the final papers today. "The vineyard is safe. The business is restructured, and the family can keep their dignity. No one needs to know how close we came to losing everything." Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them believe they saved themselves. How naive I'd been, thinking that silence was nobility. I'd operated from the shadows for so long that I'd forgotten how to step into the light. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door to find Evander standing in the hallway, still wearing his dinner clothes but looking rumpled and uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside to let him in, noting how he wouldn't quite meet my eyes as he settled into the chair across from mine. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," he began, his hands fidgeting with his watch. "The seating arrangement, the comments. Belle doesn't understand how close we used to be. And you haven't explained it to her." He was quiet for a long moment. "She has very specific ideas about family dynamics. She thinks some relationships hold people back from moving forward." "Relationships like ours?" "You have to understand, Belle's vision for our future is so clear, so ambitious. She sees opportunities no one ever would have imagined: the vineyard expansion, the luxury event venue, the wine club memberships. She's going to take everything to the next level." "With what money, Evander?" The question hung in the air between us. I watched color drain from his face as the implications sank in. "We've got investors lined up," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Belle's father has connections, and there's this group from the city that specializes in luxury hospitality ventures. Have you seen the contracts for these investments? Belle handles most of the business side of things now. She's got an MBA, you know, from Wharton." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Evander, please tell me you haven't signed anything without reading it yourself." But his expression told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I woke to find an email from Francis with an attachment labeled "Willowbrook Financial Summary, Confidential." The document was thorough and devastating, a complete breakdown of every financial transaction related to the estate, the vineyard, and the family business over the past 5 years. My contributions were highlighted in blue: loan forgiveness, direct investments, property transfers, and operational support totaling nearly $8 million. At the bottom, Francis had included a note: also found some interesting mortgage documents filed last month. Thought you should see these. The attached mortgage papers made my blood run cold. Someone had taken out a substantial loan using the Willowbrook property as collateral, property that was still technically held in trust with me as the primary beneficiary. The signature on the documents was Belle's father, Marcus Fairfield, but the loan application listed Atlas Holdings as a co-signer. I'd never signed any such document. My hand shook as I reached for my phone. Frances answered on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "Those mortgage papers are completely fraudulent. Your signature's been forged, and they've listed assets you never agreed to pledge." "How much are we talking about?" $2.7 million. The money's already been transferred to an account belonging to Fairfield Event Consulting, that's Belle's family business. I sank into my chair, the magnitude of the betrayal washing over me. They hadn't just dismissed me and disrespected me. They'd stolen from me. "Francis," I said, "I need you to start making some calls. Freeze any accounts connected to Willowbrook or the family business that require my authorization. Contact our lawyer about the fraudulent mortgage and prepare that red binder. I think I'm going to need it sooner than expected." The morning's wedding activities included a tour of the estate for out-of-town guests. I joined the group, curious to see how the family's financial struggles and my contributions would be presented to strangers. The wedding planner, a polished woman named Victoria, led the group through the main house and out to the vineyard with practiced enthusiasm. The Willowbrook estate represents 3 generations of the Morrison family's dedication to winemaking excellence, she announced as we walked among the vines. The current owners, Evander Morrison and his bride, Belle Fairfield, have transformed this property from a struggling family business into a premier destination for luxury events and premium wine production. I bit my tongue as she continued, describing renovations I'd funded and improvements I'd suggested as if they were Evander and Belle's brilliant innovations. The guests oohed and awed appropriately, clearly impressed by the success story they were hearing. The tasting room renovation alone cost over $400,000, Victoria continued, gesturing toward the elegant stone building where the reception would be held. But the investment has already paid off with their growing wine club membership and private event bookings. A well-dressed older gentleman raised his hand. "How did they manage such an extensive renovation so quickly?" "The property looks like it's been professionally maintained for decades." Victoria glanced back toward the main house where I could see Belle watching from a window. "The family has always been very strategic about their investments. Sometimes the best business decisions happen behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, I almost laughed at the irony. After the tour, I found myself walking alone through the gardens when my great-aunt Eloise appeared on the path ahead of me. At 82, she was the family matriarch, sharp as ever despite using a walking stick for balance. "Charlotte, dear," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came with decades of family leadership. "Walk with me." We strolled in comfortable silence until we reached a bench overlooking the vineyard, the same spot where I'd sat with Evander years ago when we'd first discussed saving the family business. "They think you've disappeared," Eloise said without preamble. "Faded into the background like a forgotten photograph. But I remember who you really are." "I'm not sure I remember anymore," I admitted. Eloise turned to face me fully, her pale blue eyes intense. "You're Margaret's daughter. Your mother never let anyone diminish her presence, and she raised you to be equally strong. But somewhere along the way, you decided that hiding your light was more virtuous than shining it. I thought humility was more important than recognition." "Humility, yes," she said, reaching over and patting my hand with surprising firmness. "Obscurity, no. Maybe it's time they see what you've become instead of what they assume you are." That afternoon, my phone buzzed with another message from Francis. "Bank confirms the fraudulent mortgage. Also sending you the complete family business ledger. Thought you might want to review exactly how much you've forgiven over the years." The ledger made for sobering reading. Beyond the major vineyard investment, There were dozens of smaller transactions: Evander's college tuition when his father couldn't pay, cousin Juliet's cancer treatment bills, Uncle David's bankruptcy attorney fees, Aunt Susan's divorce settlement. I'd quietly covered emergencies and crises for years, always with the understanding that family helped family without keeping score. But now I realized that my silence had allowed them to forget my help entirely. A memory surfaced of Juliet's call 3 years ago, her voice breaking as she explained that her insurance had been denied and she couldn't afford the experimental treatment her oncologist recommended. I'd transferred the money that same day, asking only that she focus on getting well. When she'd recovered and tried to thank me, I'd deflected, saying I was just glad everything worked out. At the time, I'd thought I was being noble. Now I wondered if I'd simply been naive. The evening brought another family gathering, cocktails on the terrace before the rehearsal dinner. I arrived to find the usual suspects clustered in their familiar groups, wine glasses in hand, voices animated with pre-wedding excitement. I was making my way toward the bar when I overheard a conversation between two of Evander's groomsmen. "So what's the deal with Charlotte?" one asked. "Evander's cousin, right?" "Yeah. She used to babysit him when they were kids." The other replied with a chuckle. "Belle says she's harmless but kind of awkward. Like she shows up to family stuff but doesn't really contribute anything useful. Think she'll give a toast tomorrow? God, I hope not. Can you imagine? I remember when Evander was in diapers, that kind of thing." Belle already told the DJ there's no room on the speech schedule for unexpected speakers. No room on the speech schedule. I'd helped raise Evander after his mother died, had been there for every important moment of his life until Belle arrived, and now there was no room for me to speak at his wedding. I turned away from the groomsmen and nearly collided with Juliet, who was approaching with 2 glasses of wine. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering me one of the glasses. Juliet looked radiant, her dark hair gleaming, her skin healthy and glowing. The contrast to how she looked during her treatment was striking, and I felt a familiar surge of gratitude that I'd been able to help save her life. "The wedding is beautiful," I said, accepting the wine. "It is, but Charlotte," she lowered her voice and glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, "I know what you did for me. The treatment, the hospital bills, all of it. I've always known." My cheeks flushed. "Juliet, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Because everyone else seems to have forgotten how you show up for this family. Maybe it's time they remembered." Before I could respond, she'd moved away, leaving me standing alone with my wine and my thoughts. That night, I called Francis one more time. "I need you to prepare something for me," I said. "A complete dossier of my financial involvement with the family, not just the vineyard, but everything. Every loan forgiveness, every emergency payment, every quiet bailout. I want dates, amounts, and documentation for all of it. The red binder, and Francis, I want copies made for select family members. If this weekend is going to end badly, I want everyone to understand exactly what they're losing." The wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect weather that seemed orchestrated by the gods of romantic celebrations. Golden sunlight streamed across the estate, highlighting the pristine white chairs arranged in precise rows facing an arch of cascading white roses and greenery. From my window, I could see vendors arriving in steady streams, florists making final adjustments, caterers unloading silver serving pieces, musicians tuning instruments on the terrace. Everything looked flawless from the outside, but I could sense the underlying tension that comes with any production this elaborate. By 8 in the morning, my phone was already buzzing with messages from Francis. County records show 3 more questionable loan applications filed this week, all using Atlas Holdings as collateral, none legitimate. I set my phone aside and tried to focus on getting ready. I'd chosen a simple navy dress that was elegant without being flashy, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who could blend into any crowd, exactly what I'd trained myself to become. A knock at my door interrupted my preparation. I opened it to find a young man in a polo shirt holding a walkie-talkie and clipboard. "Ms. Morrison, I'm Jake from the wedding coordination team. We need someone to help manage parking logistics this morning. The bride thought you might be available." I stared at him for a moment, processing the request. Parking logistics at my cousin's wedding on property I'd helped save from foreclosure. I think there might be some confusion, I said carefully. I'm a guest at the wedding. Jake consulted his clipboard, looking genuinely confused. Oh, well, the bride specifically mentioned Charlotte Morrison for parking coordination. She said you were really good at helping out with background stuff. Background stuff. I thanked Jake and closed the door, leaning against it as the full weight of Belle's intent became clear. She wasn't just dismissing me. She was actively trying to humiliate me in front of the entire family. An hour later, I was standing in the estate's main foyer when Frances called with news that made my blood run cold. I'd been digging deeper into the Fairfield family finances, she said without preamble. Charlotte, they're completely leveraged. The event planning business, Belle's father's investments, even their personal residences, everything is mortgaged to the hilt. And most of the loans are secured against properties they don't actually own, especially Willowbrook. They borrowed nearly $4 million against the estate's value, but according to the trust documents, they don't have legal authority to use it as collateral. Only you do. I felt the room spin slightly. Frances, what happens if those loans get called in? Complete financial collapse. The Fairfields would lose everything, and Evander would be liable as co-signer on several of the mortgages. We're talking bankruptcy, possible fraud charges, the works. I ended the call and walked outside to find some fresh air, but instead found myself face to face with a man I recognized as Harold Payton, president of First National Bank. He had handled several of my business loans over the years and greeted me with genuine warmth. Charlotte, what a surprise to see you here. Beautiful wedding setup. The estate looks magnificent. Thank you, Harold. It's my cousin's wedding. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. We've had some unusual activity on accounts connected to Atlas Holdings. Several loan applications that seemed irregular. I wanted to give you a heads up before we processed anything. My heart started racing. What kind of loan applications? Substantial amounts using your company as collateral. The signatures looked authentic, but something felt off about the paperwork. We've put a hold on everything until we can verify authorization directly with you. I thanked Harold and watched him walk away, my mind racing through the implications. They'd been systematic about their theft, but they'd also been sloppy. One phone call from me to the bank, and their entire house of cards would collapse. The morning continued with a steady stream of revelations. During the brunch service, I overheard the caterer explaining to another vendor that payment for services had been declined twice, but that the family financial manager had assured him everything would be resolved before the reception. The florist mentioned to her assistant that she'd only agreed to proceed with the elaborate arrangements because the deposit had been guaranteed by that investment company, Atlas something. Even the string quartet was discussing payment delays, wondering if they should pack up their instruments until their check cleared. I was witnessing the financial house of cards in real time, and it was all built on my forged signature and fraudulent use of my assets. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock with the kind of pageantry that only unlimited funds could provide. Belle looked stunning in her designer gown, and Evander was handsome in his custom tuxedo as they took their places at the flower-draped altar. The string quartet played beautifully, and the late afternoon light cast everything in a golden glow that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. But as I watched from my seat in the back, they'd found me a proper chair this time, though still far from the family section. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching an elaborate performance funded entirely by money that didn't belong to the performers. During the vows, Evander spoke about building a future with his beloved, about dreams becoming reality through love and determination. Belle talked about finding her perfect partner, someone who understood her vision and shared her ambitions. The words were beautiful, but they felt hollow knowing the foundation of lies underneath. When the officiant asked if anyone had reason these two should not be wed, the traditional moment of silence stretched longer than usual. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me as if the entire wedding party was holding its breath. For a wild moment, I considered standing up and revealing everything I'd learned about the fraudulent loans and forged documents. Instead, I remained silent, watching as my cousin married a woman who'd systematically stolen from me while treating me like hired help. The cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, with guests mingling on the terrace while photographers captured endless shots of the happy couple. I found myself gravitating toward the edge of the crowd, observing rather than participating, when Juliet appeared at my side. "You look like someone processing some heavy thoughts," she said quietly. "Just taking it all in," I replied. Juliet studied my face for a moment, then reached into her small purse and pulled out a red folder. "Francis asked me to give this to you." I accepted the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a complete summary of my financial involvement with the family over the past decade, every loan, every gift, every quiet bailout documented in stark black and white. The total was staggering, even to me. "Charlotte," Juliet said, her voice barely audible over the cocktail party chatter, "I don't know what's been going on this weekend, but I know you've been treated terribly, and I know this family owes you more than they've ever acknowledged." Before I could respond, she melted back into the crowd, leaving me alone with the red folder and the weight of everything it contained. As the evening progressed, the perfect wedding facade began showing more cracks. The photographer's assistant mentioned that their equipment insurance required immediate payment before they could continue shooting. The DJ had to make multiple trips to his van to retrieve backup equipment because the promised power supply wasn't adequate. Even the elaborate ice sculpture was melting faster than expected because the climate control system wasn't functioning properly. Each small crisis was handled quietly by the vendors and staff, but I could see the stress mounting in Belle's increasingly tight smile and the way Evander kept checking his phone between photo sessions. The reception dinner was a study in contrasts, beautiful presentation masking underlying chaos. The food was exquisite, but I noticed several tables didn't receive their meal courses at the same time. The wine selection was premium, but the servers seemed confused about which bottles went with which courses. The centerpieces were stunning, but half the candles had burned down to nothing because the timing was off. I was seated at what was clearly meant to be the least important table, a mix of distant relatives and family friends who'd been given courtesy invitations. The conversation was pleasant enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching everything unravel in slow motion. During the main course, my phone buzzed with a text from Francis. "Bank confirms all loans are fraudulent. Legal team standing by. Also, power company says estate account is behind on payments. Automatic shutoff scheduled for 9 p.m. unless brought current." I glanced at my watch, 8:15 p.m. The reception was scheduled to continue until midnight with dancing and celebration that would require full lighting and sound systems. In 45 minutes, Belle and Evander's perfect wedding would literally go dark. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could quietly handle the power bill and the banking crisis, allowing the wedding to continue and the financial fraud to remain hidden. I could be the invisible guardian angel one more time, protecting people who treated me like I didn't matter. Or I could finally step into the light and let the consequences of their choices play out naturally. I excused myself from the dinner table and walked to a quiet corner of the terrace, pulling out my phone to call Francis. "Are you ready to make some calls?" I asked when she answered. "Just say the word." I looked back at the reception in full swing, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the beautiful couple basking in their moment of glory. Everything funded by money stolen from me, celebrated by people who thought I was irrelevant, orchestrated by a woman who'd handed me a serving tray and suggested I belonged in the kitchen. "Francis," I said quietly, "pull the plug." With Francis on the line and my decision made, I walked further away from the reception's golden glow, finding a quiet spot near the vineyard where the music became a distant hum. The weight of years of silent endurance lifted from my shoulders as I spoke the words I'd been holding back all weekend. "Francis, I need you to freeze all accounts connected to Willowbrook Estate immediately. Cancel authorization for any vendors still expecting payment through Atlas Holdings and contact the power company. Tell them we're disputing the account transfer and won't be covering the outstanding balance." "Consider it done," Francis replied, her voice crisp with efficiency. "The bank confirmations will take about 15 minutes to process. Should I send the fraud documentation to local authorities as well?" I watched through the terrace windows as Belle laughed at something one of her bridesmaids said, her hand resting possessively on Evander's arm. She looked so confident, so secure in her perfect moment. Yes. Send everything to the district attorney's office. Make sure they understand the scope of the identity theft and financial fraud. As I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't protecting anyone from the consequences of their choices. I wasn't being the invisible safety net that allowed others to take credit for my contributions. I was simply letting the truth unfold. The first sign of trouble came 20 minutes later. I was walking back toward the reception when I heard raised voices from the direction of the catering tent. Through the canvas walls, I could make out the head chef speaking urgently into his phone. No, I understand the payment was declined, but we're in the middle of service. You can't just freeze our authorization now. A pause. Then what do you mean Atlas Holdings has disputed the charges? Who the hell is Atlas Holdings? I slipped past the tent and rejoined the reception where dessert was being served and the evening's entertainment was beginning. A jazz trio had taken the stage, filling the air with smooth melodies while guests enjoyed wedding cake and champagne. Everything still looked perfect on the surface, but I could see the subtle signs of chaos beginning to ripple outward. Servers were huddled in urgent conversations near the kitchen entrance. The wedding coordinator kept checking her phone with increasingly worried expressions. The photographer had stopped taking pictures and was speaking intensely with his assistant. At 8:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled power shut off, the music stopped abruptly. The jazz trio looked confused as their sound system went dead, leaving only the murmur of guest conversations and the clink of silverware on china. Technical difficulties, the wedding coordinator announced with forced cheerfulness. We'll have everything back up and running in just a moment. But I knew better. Frances had worked quickly. Belle appeared at the coordinator's side, her smile strained but still intact. Even from across the terrace, I could see the tension in her shoulders as she gestured toward the sound equipment. Evander joined them, his brow furrowed with concern. Then the lights went out, not all at once, that would have been too dramatic. Instead, they flickered and dimmed section by section, starting with the string lights draped through the trees and moving inward toward the main reception area. The effect was almost poetic, like watching stars disappear one by one from a darkening sky. Guests looked around uncertainly, some laughing nervously, others pulling out their phones to provide makeshift illumination. The wedding coordinator's voice cut through the growing murmur. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some temporary power issues. Please remain calm while we switch to our backup generators. But there would be no backup generators. I'd made sure of that when I researched the estate's infrastructure months ago during my due diligence. The backup power system was connected to my solar installation company, and that authorization had been revoked along with everything else. In the dim glow of cell phone lights, I watched Belle's composure finally begin to crack. She was speaking urgently to someone on her phone, her free hand gesturing frantically as she paced near the darkened stage. What do you mean the payment was declined? Her voice carried across the now quiet terrace. Check again. There has to be some mistake. Evander was at her side immediately, trying to calm her, but I could see the panic starting to spread between them like a contagion. Other family members had begun to take notice, creating small clusters of confused conversation. That's when I saw Juliet moving through the crowd with purposeful steps, carrying a stack of red folders. She was distributing them to specific people: Aunt Eloise, Uncle Robert, Cousin Michael, and several other family members who held positions of influence within our extended clan. Aunt Vivian was the first to open her folder, using her phone's flashlight to read the contents. Even in the dim light, I could see her face change as she processed the information. Her mouth fell open, and she looked up sharply, scanning the crowd until her eyes found mine. Charlotte, she called out, her voice cutting through the general confusion. Charlotte, could you come here, please? Other family members were opening their folders now, similar expressions of shock and disbelief spreading across their faces. Uncle Robert actually sat down heavily in the nearest chair, staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. I walked slowly toward the growing cluster of relatives, my heart beating steadily despite the chaos erupting around me. This was the moment I'd been avoiding for years, the moment when I stopped hiding and let everyone see exactly who I really was. Aunt Eloise's voice was sharp with authority. These documents show you own 72% of the family's assets, including this estate. The conversation around us gradually died as more guests became aware that something significant was happening. Belle had stopped her frantic phone calls and was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, confusion mixed with dawning horror. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "Charlotte doesn't, she's just what?" Eloise's question hung in the air like a challenge. Evander stepped forward, his face pale in the phone light illumination. "Charlotte, what's going on? These documents, the power outage, are you?" "Am I what, Evander?" I kept my voice calm, conversational. "Am I the person who saved this estate when you were about to lose it? Am I the one who restructured the family business when it was weeks away from bankruptcy? Am I the invisible guardian who's been quietly covering everyone's emergencies for the past decade?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of vehicles starting up in the distance. The vendors were leaving. Belle's phone rang, and she answered with shaking hands. The conversation was brief and one-sided, consisting mostly of her saying, "But that's impossible," and "There must be some mistake," in increasingly desperate tones. When she hung up, her face was ashen. "The caterers are packing up. They say their payment authorization was revoked by someone named Atlas Holdings." "That would be my company," I said simply. "Your company?" Belle's voice cracked on the words. "But you're not, I'm not what? Successful? Important? Worth taking seriously?" I pulled out my own phone and speed-dialed Francis. "Francis, could you please explain to everyone here what Atlas Holdings is?" I put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear Francis's clear, professional voice. "Atlas Holdings is a private investment firm with assets exceeding $50 million. Charlotte Morrison is the founder and CEO. The company holds controlling interests in 3 wineries, 2 event venues, a solar installation business, and various real estate properties throughout the region, including the Willowbrook estate." Belle sat down abruptly as if her legs had given out. $50 million. The Fairfield family has been using forged documents to borrow against Atlas Holdings assets, Francis continued. "We've documented nearly $4 million in fraudulent loans, all secured with Charlotte's forged signature. Local authorities have been notified." Evander made a choking sound. "4 million? Belle?" But Belle couldn't answer. She was staring at me as if I'd transformed into someone completely different, which, in a way, I supposed I had. "How?" she whispered. "How did we not know?" "Because I chose not to tell you," I replied. "Because I thought humility was more important than recognition. Because I believed that helping quietly was more noble than taking credit." Uncle Robert cleared his throat, still holding his red folder. "Charlotte, according to these documents, you paid for my daughter's wedding 3 years ago. And my medical bills," Juliet added, stepping forward from the crowd. "All of them, the experimental treatment, the hospital stays, everything." More voices began chiming in as family members realized the scope of my hidden generosity: college tuitions, divorce lawyers, business loans, emergency surgeries. A decade of quiet bailouts that I never mentioned and they'd chosen to forget. "I thought you were just living off your trust fund," Aunt Vivian said, her voice small with embarrassment. "I was. I used my inheritance to build something bigger, something that could help all of you when you needed it. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as someone who contributed to this family and started seeing me as someone who just showed up to events." Belle suddenly stood up, her composure snapping back into place like armor. "This is ridiculous. Even if you do have money, you can't just destroy someone's wedding because your feelings got hurt." The words hung in the air like a slap. Around us, I could hear the sounds of the wedding being dismantled, vendors packing equipment, vehicles driving away, the systematic destruction of what had been a perfect celebration. "I didn't destroy your wedding, Belle," I said. "I simply stopped paying for it." "What do you mean stopped paying for it?" I looked around at the family members gathered in our impromptu circle, their faces illuminated by the scattered glow of cell phone lights. Every vendor here tonight was being paid through Atlas Holdings accounts: the catering, the flowers, the music, the photography, even the wedding dress and the honeymoon reservations. Your family borrowed against my assets to fund this entire celebration. Evander's face went white. That's impossible. Belle's father arranged the financing. Your father-in-law forged my signature on loan documents worth nearly $4 million. He used my company as collateral for debt that your new family has no intention of repaying. Belle's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. You're lying. My father would never. Francis, I said into the phone, could you read the summary of the fraudulent loans, please? Francis's voice was crisp and professional as she detailed each forged document, each unauthorized use of my assets, each violation of federal banking laws that the Fairfield family had committed. The list was long and damning. When she finished, the silence was complete except for the distant sound of car doors slamming as the last of the vendors departed. This wedding is over, I said quietly. The vendors have been released from their contracts. The venue rental has been terminated, and law enforcement has been notified about the financial fraud. Belle's carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely. You can't do this. This is my wedding day. People will talk about this forever. Yes, I agreed. They will. The aftermath of my revelation was swift and merciless. Guests began departing in confused clusters, some stopping to offer awkward condolences to Evander and Belle, others simply fleeing the scene as quickly as possible. The elegant reception dissolved into chaos as people fumbled for car keys in the darkness and tried to process what they'd just witnessed. I remained standing in the center of it all, watching the destruction of Belle's perfect vision with a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices that others had made. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to fix someone else's crisis or minimize the fallout from their poor decisions. Evander approached me as the crowd thinned, his wedding attire disheveled and his face streaked with tears I hadn't expected to see. Charlotte, he said, his voice breaking on my name. I didn't know about the loans, about what Belle's father did. I swear I didn't know. I studied his face in the dim light of scattered phones, looking for signs of deception but finding only genuine anguish. But you knew I'd been helping the family financially for years, I said. You knew I'd saved the vineyard, covered emergencies, supported everyone through their crises, and you chose to let Belle treat me like I was irrelevant. She said you were holding me back from my potential, that I needed to focus on building a future instead of being grateful for the past. And you believed her? Evander's shoulders sagged. I wanted to believe her. She made everything seem possible: the expansion, the luxury events, the wine club memberships. She had such big dreams. And she made you feel like you could be part of something important. You were already part of something important, I said. You were part of a family that supported each other. But that wasn't enough for her, was it? He shook his head, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. I should have stood up for you when she handed you that tray. When she excluded you from the seating arrangements. When she talked about you like you didn't matter. I should have stopped it all. Yes, I said simply. You should have. The honesty of my response seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He doubled over slightly, his hands pressed to his face, and I could hear the depth of his regret in every ragged breath. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Charlotte. You were like a sister to me, and I let her erase everything you meant to our family. For a moment, I felt the old instinct to comfort him, to minimize his guilt and take responsibility for the situation myself. But I'd spent too many years protecting people from the consequences of their choices. I know you're sorry, Evander, I said, but being sorry doesn't undo the damage. As we spoke, I became aware of another conversation happening nearby. Aunt Eloise was speaking in urgent, low tones to several family elders, and I caught fragments of what sounded like serious planning. Need to make this right, years of taking advantage, update the estate planning immediately. When their huddle broke up, Eloise approached me with a kind of determined expression that had made her a formidable family matriarch for decades. "Charlotte, dear, we need to discuss some changes." "Legal changes." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that ensure you're properly recognized for your contributions to this family. Starting with my will." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Aunt Eloise, you don't need to. I absolutely do need to. I'm removing Evander as executor of my estate and naming you instead. The lake house, the stock portfolio, the family papers, they should go to someone who understands responsibility and loyalty. But Evander is your great-nephew. And you're my great-niece who spent a decade quietly keeping this family afloat while he played house with a woman who stole from you." Her voice was sharp with finality. "Some actions have permanent consequences, Charlotte. It's time this family learned that lesson." Across the terrace, I could see Belle on her phone again, her voice rising with each failed call. Her elaborate wedding dress trailed behind her as she paced, a white flag of surrender in the growing darkness. "Daddy, you have to fix this," she was saying. "The bank is saying something about fraud charges and people are leaving and the whole wedding is ruined." But whatever response she received only seemed to make things worse. She ended the call and threw her phone down onto one of the abandoned dinner tables with enough force to crack the screen. Juliet appeared at my side, her expression troubled but determined. "Charlotte, I need to tell you something about tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" "I was supposed to be interviewed by that lifestyle blogger, you know, the one who covers high society weddings. She wanted to write about Belle's vision and how the family business had become such a success story. I could see where this was heading. And now? Now I'm going to tell her the real story, about the family member who actually built the business, who quietly supported everyone through their crises, who got treated like hired help at her own cousin's wedding." Juliet's voice was firm with resolve. "It's time people knew the truth about who you really are." "Juliet, you don't need recognition, I know. But the rest of us need to give it to you anyway. We need to stop letting you hide in the shadows while taking credit for your generosity." As if summoned by our conversation, more family members began approaching, some to apologize, others to share their own stories of my quiet help over the years, all of them grappling with the realization that they'd completely misjudged the person they thought they knew. Uncle David, whose bankruptcy I'd helped him avoid 3 years earlier, was particularly emotional. "I told everyone I'd turned my business around through hard work and determination," he admitted. "I never mentioned that you'd forgiven the loan that saved my house." Cousin Sarah, whose daughter's medical emergency I'd covered, shook her head in amazement. "I thought you were just comfortable. I had no idea you were running a multi-million-dollar company." Each conversation was a small reckoning, a moment of clarity about years of assumptions and overlooked truths. But the person I most wanted to talk to was nowhere to be found. "Where's Belle?" I asked Juliet. "Last I saw, she was in the bridal suite with her mother and sisters. I think they're trying to figure out their legal situation." I made my way inside the main house, following the sound of raised voices to the elegant suite where Belle had prepared for her wedding just hours earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the conversation clearly. "Federal crime, Belle. Identity theft, bank fraud, conspiracy. Daddy could go to prison for this. But we didn't know she was rich. If we'd known, we never would have. That's not a legal defense. You can't steal from someone just because you think they can afford it." "We weren't stealing. We were borrowing against family assets. Evander said the estate belonged to all of them." "Evander was wrong, and you should have done your own research before you let Daddy forge loan documents." I knocked gently on the door, and the conversation stopped abruptly. After a moment, Belle's mother opened it, her face pale and drawn. "Charlotte," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd like to speak with Belle, please." Belle appeared behind her mother, still wearing her wedding dress but looking like a completely different person than the confident bride I'd watched earlier. Her makeup was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, and her hands were shaking. "I want to apologize," she said quickly. "About everything, the way I treated you, the things I said. I didn't know who you really were." That's the problem, Belle. You never tried to find out who I really was. You made assumptions based on how I dressed and how quietly I lived. And you decided I wasn't worth treating with respect. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. But if I'd known you were wealthy, you would have treated me differently, which tells me everything I need to know about your character. So what happens now? She asked. Are you going to press charges? Are you going to destroy my family? I considered the question seriously. The fraud was extensive and well documented. The Fairfield family had committed multiple felonies, and they deserved to face the full consequences of their actions. But I also knew that revenge wouldn't undo the damage or heal the wounds they'd created. What happens now depends on what you choose to do going forward, I said finally. The legal system will handle the criminal charges. That's out of my hands now. But how you rebuild from this point is up to you. Rebuild? She laughed bitterly. How do you rebuild from something like this? Everyone knows what happened. The whole family, all our friends, they all saw you shut down my wedding. They saw me stop paying for your wedding, I corrected. There's a difference. As I turned to leave, Belle called out one last question. Why didn't you just tell us? Why did you hide who you really were? I paused in the doorway, considering how to answer. Because I thought character mattered more than bank balances. I thought that if I lived quietly and helped generously, people would see my value as a person rather than just my net worth. I looked back at her tear-streaked face. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about you. 3 months after the wedding that never was, I stood on the deck of my new home, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and coral. The house was smaller than Willowbrook, simpler in design, but it was entirely mine, chosen for its privacy and beauty rather than its ability to impress others. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed from the beach below. I'd been walking that beach every morning since moving in, finding peace in the rhythm of waves and the endless horizon that reminded me how small our daily dramas really were in the grand scheme of things. My phone rang, interrupting my meditation. Francis's name appeared on the screen. Good morning, I answered. What's the news from the civilized world? The Atlas Foundation paperwork is complete, she reported with satisfaction. You're officially ready to begin accepting grant applications from young women entrepreneurs. The first round of applicants looks incredibly promising. The Atlas Foundation had been my first major project after leaving the chaos of family drama behind. Instead of quietly supporting relatives who took my help for granted, I decided to invest in strangers who would appreciate the opportunity to build something meaningful. Any word from the legal proceedings? Marcus Fairfield pleaded guilty to all charges yesterday. He'll serve 18 months in federal prison and pay full restitution. Belle's been cooperating with prosecutors, which should help her avoid jail time. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at the news. Justice was being served, but it had come at a tremendous cost to everyone involved. And Evander? Still in therapy, according to Juliet. He's been attending those sessions you recommended, and he's apparently making progress. He sent another letter yesterday. Evander had been writing to me weekly since the wedding disaster, long handwritten letters full of apologies and self-reflection. I'd read the first few but eventually asked Francis to screen them and only pass along anything that seemed genuinely important. Does this one say anything new? He's moving to Oregon, starting over with a small organic farm, completely disconnected from the family business. He wanted you to know that he's trying to become the kind of person who deserves your forgiveness someday. The information stirred complicated emotions in me. Part of me was glad that Evander was taking responsibility for his choices and working to become better, but another part of me knew that some damage couldn't be undone with therapy and good intentions. File it with the others, I said. Maybe someday I'll be ready to read them all. After ending the call, I walked back inside to prepare for my day. The house was decorated simply but beautifully with clean lines and natural materials that felt calming rather than ostentatious. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every carefully chosen detail reflected my actual taste rather than what I thought would impress others. In my home office, I reviewed the morning's emails. There were grant applications from the foundation, updates from my investment portfolio, and several invitations to social events that I'd probably decline. I'd become much more selective about how I spent my time and energy. One email caught my attention, a note from Juliet with the subject line, "Something you should see." "Charlotte," she'd written, "the article about you came out in Metropolitan magazine today. I thought you might want to read it before other people start calling." I clicked the attached link and found myself looking at a feature story titled "The Hidden Heiress: How One Woman's Quiet Generosity Supported an Entire Family." The accompanying photo showed me at a foundation event, smiling genuinely as I shook hands with one of our grant recipients. The article was fair and factual, focusing more on my business success and philanthropic work than on the wedding disaster. Juliet had clearly been thoughtful about how she framed the story, emphasizing my achievements rather than my family's failures. But I knew the attention would be unwelcome. I'd spent years cultivating privacy and anonymity, and magazine features were the opposite of what I wanted. My doorbell rang before I could finish reading the article. I wasn't expecting anyone, and few people knew my new address. Through the window, I could see a delivery truck and a man holding an enormous flower arrangement. "Delivery for Charlotte Morrison," he said when I opened the door. The flowers were beautiful, white roses and eucalyptus in a simple glass vase, but I couldn't imagine who would have sent them. The card was handwritten in elegant script, "Thank you for showing me what true grace looks like. I hope someday I can earn the right to call you family again, Evander." I set the flowers on my kitchen counter and stared at them for a long moment. They were lovely, and the sentiment was genuine, but they also represented everything I was trying to leave behind: the family drama, the guilt and obligation, the endless cycle of forgiveness and disappointment that had defined my relationships for so many years. My phone rang again, a number I didn't recognize. "Morrison," a woman said when I answered. "This is Rebecca Chen from the Pacific Coast Women's Business Association. We saw the article about your foundation work, and we'd love to discuss having you as our keynote speaker at next month's conference." I found myself smiling as I scheduled the speaking engagement. This was the kind of attention I could appreciate: recognition for work I was proud of, connections with people who shared my values, opportunities to make a real difference in the world. Over the following weeks, similar calls came regularly: invitations to join boards of directors, requests for investment advice, opportunities to mentor young entrepreneurs. It was as if stepping into the light at that disastrous wedding had finally allowed people to see me clearly. But the most meaningful conversation came from an unexpected source. I was working in my garden one afternoon when my housekeeper mentioned that a young woman had stopped by asking for me. She said her name was Kala and that you'd been mentoring her. She seemed very excited about something. Kala was one of my first foundation grant recipients, a brilliant 23-year-old who was developing sustainable packaging solutions for small businesses. I'd been meeting with her monthly, offering advice and encouragement as she navigated the challenges of entrepreneurship. I found her waiting on my front porch, practically vibrating with excitement. "Charlotte, I got the contract, the big grocery chain. They're going to use my packaging for their entire organic produce line." Her joy was infectious, and I found myself grinning as she described the months of negotiations and testing that had led to this breakthrough. "This was why I started the foundation," I said, "to support people who have genuine passion and talent but lack the resources to pursue their dreams." "I couldn't have done this without you," Kala continued. "Not just the money, but the advice, the connections, the confidence you helped me build. You changed my life." As I watched her drive away, still bubbling with excitement about her future, I realized something important. For years, I'd defined my worth by how much I could help my family, how many crises I could solve, how invisible I could make myself while still being useful. But that kind of giving had been based on obligation and guilt rather than choice and joy. This was different. Supporting Kala and the other foundation recipients felt energizing rather than draining. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than family drama and unearned expectations. That evening, I sat on my deck again, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. A letter had arrived from the family lawyer informing me that Aunt Eloise had indeed updated her will as promised. I was now the primary beneficiary of her estate, responsible for preserving and distributing the family's historical documents and heirloom pieces. The irony wasn't lost on me. By finally standing up for myself and refusing to be invisible, I'd gained more family responsibility than ever before. But this felt different too. It was recognition rather than exploitation, legacy rather than burden. My phone buzzed with a text from Francis. Dinner tomorrow? I have updates on the foundation applications and I found an excellent restaurant that specializes in quiet corners for important conversations. I typed back quickly, perfect. And Francis, thank you for everything. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You could have, she replied. You just finally decided you were worth the effort. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. The wedding disaster had been painful and embarrassing, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes the only way to build something new is to let the old structure collapse completely. I pulled out my journal, a new one, with blank pages that weren't filled with crisis management and family emergencies, and began to write. They asked me to help in the kitchen, thinking I belonged with the hired help rather than the honored guests. What they didn't understand is that I'd built the entire house, not just the kitchen, but the foundation, the walls, the roof that sheltered all of them. But houses can be rebuilt, and families can be reimagined. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is let people experience the full consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most loving act is refusing to enable destructive behavior. I spent years thinking that hiding my light was humble and noble. I was wrong. The most powerful thing you can do is let people see exactly who you are, not to intimidate or impress them, but to give them the chance to love and respect the real you. Some people will rise to meet that authenticity. Others will reveal themselves as unworthy of it. Both outcomes are gifts because both lead to truth. Today, I help launch a business that will create jobs and reduce environmental waste. Tomorrow I'll mentor another young woman who has big dreams and limited resources. Next week I'll speak to a conference full of entrepreneurs who are building the future. This is what power looks like when it's used intentionally rather than hidden apologetically. This is what happens when you stop making yourself small to accommodate people who don't value what you bring to their lives. They told me to help in the kitchen. What they didn't know is that I built the house, and now I'm building a better one.